Welcome to this session, and thanks for joining our session on managing roles with intelligent algorithms for the intelligent enterprise. So much intelligence, it's almost scary. My name is Christian Cohrs. I'm doing the presentation here in Barcelona. I'm product owner for Identity Access Governance. If I remember it correctly, there is nothing in the session that doesn't exist yet. But just in case, here's the disclaimer. So if at any point I see something where I think, oh, this is still in development, better be careful, then please take note and don't put your hopeful buying decision based on what I'm saying here. In the end, if you want to know what's definitely part of the product and legally binding, then please take a look at the documentation, which is rather extensive. Today I want to talk about intelligent ways to define roles, to design roles. And I want to start with a quick overview of where we are, where we come from. So you all know role design in the on-premise world is based on SAP Access Control, based from the GRC portfolio. And I will take Access Control as an example to introduce some key concepts, some key functionalities that we have in this overall space of access governance, access control. And then move on to my product, the Identity Access Governance solution, which is the cloud-based solution for access governance, access control that we've built on SAP Cloud Platform, and which can also be used to extend access control towards cloud-based business applications. And as part of this cloud-based solution, I want to show you what we've built there, this intelligent way of defining, designing roles based on let's call it machine learning capabilities to make it easier for you to build roles in a way that is most efficient and still compliant. Here it says demo. I have a video which I brought, and I can explain based on the video then the different steps that are relevant, and there you'll also see for yourself that it's rather quite easy and how it fits in the overall access control or access governance process. Okay, so let's start just by looking at where we are and why this topic is relevant. And the main question that people always have is, why is managing access so hard? And in fact, it becomes harder all the time because the number and the complexity of the enterprise landscape, of the application landscape, increases all of the time. If you think about what we have in the intelligent enterprise, in the end, we have business processes that go across a large number of different business applications. So, for example, total workforce management, and I have a session on that later on. You have SuccessFactors, Employee Central, you have S/4HANA Cloud, you have Analytics Cloud, you have Cloud Platform, you may have Concur, Ariba, Fieldglass. Everything in your landscape is brought together in one business process. And of course, in a scenario like that, the question, what kind of access do I need to fulfill my role as part of this business process, is not so easy to answer. And also the question if the access that I have across all of these systems might introduce some risks across or for the company is also not so easy to answer. Because just like it says here, in the past, we always had this fragmented approach to access control and access risk, because you were able to look at one system and figure out if somebody has maybe critical access there, maybe even segregation of duties risk in that system. But as we move functionalities across the landscape, it's not so easy to identify, for example, segregation of duties risks if the risk parts are in separate systems in your landscape. For example, I'm not sure, some of you may have been in the session just before this that Carmen did from our team in Sofia, and he showed that in SuccessFactors now a lot of reporting is no longer built-in reporting, but rather done based on SAP Analytics Cloud. And also for S4, there are steps to remove some of the old reporting capabilities and extend everything with Analytics Cloud. And this means that some of the things that were in the past all in one system are now spread across the landscape, moved into systems that are better fit to provide this functionality, that have more advanced capabilities, but that also means that access is now split in several systems. So you do your reporting in one system, you do your transactions in another system, but you still have access in both places, and you might be able to combine access in such a way that a critical risk could come out of that. Without a way to manage access across systems, across landscape, it means you do have to do it in a manual way. So if you cannot do it automatically, then it's manual. And of course, there's always a risk that you miss things. If you are not able to to really understand what kind of access a person has across the landscape. And if you cannot measure the access that somebody has, then you also cannot control it. So if you don't know what access people have, then you cannot identify critical access and you cannot mitigate that or even remove it. And that's why what we need as part of this intelligent enterprise, so as part of this bringing together of many applications into one process, what we need is the capability to really have a full picture also from access control perspective, to identify risks that come only when you combine different applications in the landscape into one process. Of course, intelligent enterprise is just one reason why the landscapes grow. We also see that, especially on the cloud side, many of our customers also have multi-vendor landscapes. So even though we try to promote SAP as much as possible, you all have maybe Microsoft in your landscape, maybe other applications, and this also adds to the complexity. So also there, you then have some functionality in an SAP stack, other functionality in a third-party stack, and you need to bring this together from access perspective, because if you don't, then again, there might be risks and you're not even aware of that because you only have a fragmented view on the overall access. And of course, there's then also a hybrid landscapes with all of your massive investments in the on-premise world. Also there you have some access on-premise, some access in the cloud, and bringing this together can suddenly introduce risks that you might not be aware of if you just focus on one individual system. So let's start with SAP Access Control. So the existing solution, the one that also most of our customers use, and the one that has the most broad functionality of all the access governance capabilities. And the particular focus here is on this business role management, because that's also what we will look at when we take a look at the cloud applications. So what are the key concepts there? We are working in a landscape. So if you have a classical ABAP landscape with development, quality, and production, there is an ability to do role definition. That's also very much an on-premise concept, that you can use your access control function to. Sound is going away. You can use okay. That you can use your on access control functionality to actually build roles inside of an ABAP stack that doesn't work for example, third-party applications, because there we may not have the interfaces to do these kind of things. There is a role methodology process that's also very important, and also one of the maybe more critical steps when you introduce a solution like that you really need to come to an understanding how roles are supposed to be defined in your organization. So what are the steps to define a role? Because as mentioned, access can be critical, and assigning a role can also be critical. So the role definition needs to be done in a compliant way, and you need to have a defined process of how you want to do that. So who needs to improve, what do they need to check in the end, and also make sure that everybody does it the same way, and that you don't end up with arbitrary access. Yeah, we have capabilities like mass maintenance, like mass derivation, because in the end, you're not working with one role. You might work with a large number of roles that you want to update, maybe that you also want to create based on organization value maps and so on. Access policies is also a capability that's inside of access control. There are different things that you can subsume under that. For example, when you think about firefighter capabilities, so emergency access management, if you want to define how you give somebody advanced administrative access in a business application to fix critical problems there, what's the process around that? You don't want to give everybody this kind of access. You don't want to give it for a longer period of time. So how do you define what kind of steps are necessary that I can give somebody access to maybe change an application on an administrative level, and not introduce the risk that this person might actually damage then the whole system in the long run. Role certification, also from access control, also something that we have in identity access governance. So the ability to check on a regular basis if the access that a person has still makes sense. In the end, so what you usually think about when you do access management is very much event-driven. So somebody joins the company, you give them access to a number of applications, maybe then they change a position, also their access changes. But if somebody stays in the same position position for years and nothing changes in their environment, then the question is there any need to change the access? And from system perspective, the system doesn't see any need for an update, but maybe you as a manager are aware that there is something that needs to be changed because maybe the whole environment has changed, and as a result, some access is no longer relevant, even though the person is still on the same position doing the same job. That's something that you can handle with role certification, so that you can really check for each user, maybe once per year or every couple of months, the access that they have. Does this still make sense, or do I as a manager know that some of that access can be easily taken away? Business roles is something that we will look into in much more detail later on, because this is the solution that we offer for managing really the intelligent enterprise landscape, so that you're no longer dealing with individual roles in individual systems, but rather with a business role that represents the position that you have, so the tasks that you need to do across the landscape, and not specific to one technical system that might only then support one tiny step of the overall business process. Yeah, and role mining is also something that we will have later on when we look at the process of doing role design, especially on the cloud side. Okay, yeah, landscape concept, that's typical, quite easy, typical landscape, so dev, test, and production. So here in ECC, you generate your roles in, if you think about an ABAP system on the dev side, then you roll it through the landscape. At some point, they come into production. Then you can also check there what the impact means when you really have then your productive users working with these roles. You can use access control for access analysis and so on. So that's, yeah, pretty straightforward, not so interesting, I would say. Authorization maintenance is then done separately, so the assignment of roles is one topic, but what this role really means inside of a system is a different question, because the technical role inside of a system always comes with very specific, very technical authorizations, and these also need to be defined, and that's not done in the same step. It's independent, because this is not something that is done from outside of the system or as part of an assignment, but rather it's very close to the actual development job. So defining roles inside of a system on a technical level is then something that comes independent of the role assignment. Let's look at access control key features in more detail. So some of the things I already mentioned. Role definition, a number of capabilities that you would expect when you define a role. So for example, you can assign role attributes. So that might be the project release for which a role is relevant, the criticality level that you assign to a role. So how important is it that you do compliance checks when you assign that kind of role? You need to define who is the owner for the role, and there are different kinds of owners, as you will see on the next slide. So one person might be responsible to define the content of the role. Another person might be responsible to decide who is allowed to get that role. Could be the same person, but you can also separate this. If you work with ABAP systems, then you will also deal with transaction codes, authorization values. You might have this org value mapping, so when you want to do mass derivation of roles, for example, have a role that you then map to every company code that is relevant for you, or every country. That is something that you can do with access control to come to a specific role for every kind of situation that might be relevant in your organization. I already mentioned derivation of roles, so the organizational value maps that you can use, the leading org and so on. So if you know about access control, then all of that shouldn't be new to you. It helps you to come to a full set of roles that you need to fulfill all of your end users' needs without having to create every role manually. So you have a kind of framework role that you can then map to the different companies, countries, and so on. We also have the option here to import role on mass, to do the risk analysis. Also important that when you do risk analysis, that you don't do it manually for each and every piece, but rather that you can do this in a mass level, so that you immediately see which are the areas in your, for example, user base where you need to take specific care. So which are the people that have the highest access risks, and then you can look at those first and try to figure out what you can do to mitigate the risks for them. Access policies is an interesting topic. I mentioned it earlier in the area of firefighting. So a policy that defines what is the process in your organization to come to emergency access in a system. So what kind of steps are necessary for somebody to get that access quickly, but still in a compliant way. Also, what kind of steps will later on be taken to validate that the person only did the things that were part of the task of this emergency job and not something beyond that. This is one area where an access policy makes sense. There are also other ways. For example, here it says training verification, also something that people build, that before you get a certain role, you must have a certain training, and this is something that can then be checked. So if you already have a training maybe checkmarked in SuccessFactors, then you will get an approval for a role. If you don't have this training, then the approval will not be given, and you might get then a notification that you please have to first get your training in place. One thing that it also mentions here among the basic attributes, role attributes, and this becomes important later on, there are also attributes to specify if a role is, or if a function is a single system or cross system. And that's something that we'll also see later on when we think about intelligent enterprise. Many of the functions that we're dealing with today are no longer specific to one system, but they only can be implemented if you run across several systems, because the functionality may by definition be in different systems, or maybe it was torn into several pieces from an previously one instance. So for example, if you've been using, let's say, a travel management inside of an ABAP stack in the past, and now you're moving it into Concur, then the functionality is suddenly in two different places. But what you're actually doing and the changes that you do, and also from compliance perspective, it's still one process. And you need to be able to also manage this through the right role definitions. And by assigning the attributes, you can mark this. I mentioned the methodology, and this is something that's really important because it brings together the different views on role design. Usually when you define a role, there are some steps that are relevant from business perspective. So there's a role owner, usually somebody who very much knows the business process and can decide what kind of access is necessary to run a certain business process, and maybe also what kind of access might be considered critical. But you also then need to have, for example, IT people who are able to map this access then on a technical level for a specific system. If you don't manage to bring these people together, then, for example, if a role is only driven from the business side, then you might come up with role definitions that simply cannot be implemented technically in a system. On the other hand side, if you only do your role definition based on IT knowledge, then maybe you come to roles that don't really help anyone because they are maybe end up in a fragmented way where you don't really are able to perform any meaningful functionality in the system because you always miss certain authorizations that you would require. That's why, as part of this methodology, we are really bringing these together, these sites. So we have different steps that run as part of a workflow, and there are different roles here that are responsible to decide on each step whether the definition that was done there is really the right one or not. So the role owner defines the role, but when it comes to maybe then technically assigning authorizations inside of a specific ABAP system, that's then more something that comes from the IT side. Or the role owner will also do the access analysis, so identify critical access, identify segregation of duties issues, and mitigate them before submitting this, or deciding on how to map the role to different business units, departments, countries, whatsoever. But in the end, the technical generation then once again comes from IT. And what you also see here, there's another role, this role approver, as part of the methodology. So again, the decision who in the end gives the confirmation that somebody can get a certain role in your organization or not. This is very flexible in our software, so you can say that it's the manager, for example, that always the manager of an employee is the first one to decide if an employee should get a certain role or not, which might make sense because the manager then usually knows what this person is supposed to do. but it could also be that you then add the role owner himself, just to make sure that whoever has created a role can then think about whether it makes sense that this role is maybe now used in a completely different department that he never thought of. Then he might intervene and say, no, this doesn't make any sense, I don't want this. Or it could also be a security expert. So if you have critical roles where you don't want them to be sent around the whole user base, then you might have a security expert who takes a look and then says, no, this role is so critical, I want to first maybe have a call with the manager before I approve this, because I know as a security expert what can go wrong if people have this role. So how do people usually get access? There are many different ways to do this. There's a very the low-level technical way. So you have individual systems. There you have your single roles inside of the systems with privileges, entitlements. You can then assign also roles based on attributes of the user. So for example, if a user has a certain position, then he will automatically get a specific role based on the onboarding process. Or if a user is part of a specific group, maybe in Azure AD, whatever, then you assign to that person also specific roles. You can then do mass provisioning. For example, if you have a large number of users that you want to onboard, you can use this kind of capabilities to give each of them some default roles so that they can start working without you having to look into every detail and coming up with custom roles for every person. Yeah, there are then ways to make this a bit more efficient, so derive roles so that you don't have to create each role in a custom way, but rather start with one and then modify this so that it fits to every part of your business, or have composite roles where you try to bring things together. In the past, there was also a lot of discussion about these functional enabler roles, so you can also support them with our software, meaning from access control or identity access governance side. But from what I heard, usually they don't work so well inside of the business applications, because the authorizations in the business application need to be built in such a way that you can really do these kind of combinations of roles that are required to make functional enabler roles really beneficial. The main type of roles that we look in today is business roles. The definition or the difference between a business role and the single role is that the business role then brings together a larger set of single roles across a whole landscape. Again, with the idea being that where in the past maybe a business process ran inside of one system and you just had maybe one single role, or you had a composite role for that. Today, the process runs across a larger landscape in many different applications, and from a business perspective, it's just one process, but technically it consists of several steps in several different stacks, and you need to bring them together in a business role so that when you assign, for example, the role of product manager to a person, that person is then able to do the necessary steps in S/4HANA, but also do the reporting in Analytics Cloud, also hire people maybe in Fieldglass and so on, even though it's just one person and one role from a business perspective that they have. This can then go into many different applications. So those were the more general concepts, and especially taken from the example of SAP Access Control. So our on-premise solution, we now also have Cloud Identity Access Governance, which is a cloud-based service and which already includes many of the capabilities that we have in our on-premise access control solution, and also extends the identity provisioning service that you maybe heard earlier my colleague talk about, the IPS. In the on-premise world, we had a lot of overlap between our solutions there, between identity management and access control, because, for example, workflows or UIs, end-user UIs, access requests, they were part of both products, and then sometimes people were asking which functionality should I use from which product, or if I started with one product, can I plug in the other, or do I then need to turn my whole workflow around? That's why on the cloud side, we decided that we want to really keep this separate. So the identity provisioning service is the technical integration, which allows you to move user identities and roles very quickly from one system to the other. But the identity access governance builds on top of that and then provides all the business functionality. So the end user UIs, the role mapping capabilities, and so on. So that is really now built on top of one another, and you don't have this overlap, which in the past always led to confusion and sometimes also to integration problems. So today, for example, there was earlier a question about workflows. If you want to have workflows in identity provisioning service, then you use the identity access governance solution on top, because this includes the workflows and then just triggers the IPS for the specific system interaction. So you don't need to build anything on top of that. The IAG solution is the standard for that kind of functionality. But what else do we have in identity access governance? There's a number of functionalities. Later I will look mostly at the role design service, because that's what this session is about. But there are also the other capabilities that you would expect from an access governance solution. So we have access analysis, meaning the ability to read access information from a landscape into our central repository and then do analysis on top of that. So we can identify for a user, for example, if they have critical access in some system, or if they have segregation of duties issues within one system or across a number of systems. And then the usual process starts, so how to handle this kind of risks, how to remove them or to mitigate them and so on, and there can be workflows and approvals behind that. So that's pretty much standard access analysis. Access request is then the functionality for the end users, also very much like what you have in access control, but in a nice and cloud-like UI. So you can use access request as an end user to request access in a specific system. And again, then approvals may be necessary or not, and the workflows start. And there is reporting around that so that you always know where you are with respect to your approvals and so on. Access certification is quite new. I mentioned this earlier. This is this capability that allows you to really run a campaign across your organization, where you check then for every role or for every person whether the assignments of roles to person is still valid, or if you think that maybe something in the overall company environment changed, and as a result, this kind of assignment shouldn't be in place anymore. And you can do that on a regular basis. I know from customers who did this in the past based on Excels, and of course that's a nightmare. So if you download all the access into one large Excel and then send it around in among your management team maybe, and ask people to report back, then it takes weeks until you get the information and have consolidated it, and then you can probably start with the next certification anyway. And if you don't manage to get the certification through, then you don't really know whether you're still compliant, because you might be violating your own access policy that you defined, which might say we want to check every half year if access is still on the right level. Privileged access management, or firefighter, as many people still know it, is planned for here it says Q4, so we hope to have this available by the end of the year. That's what I mentioned earlier, so the capability to give high privileges to a person for a very limited task, for a limited period of time. For example, if a production system is down, or in the cloud, if something is really going wrong inside of a business application and there is nobody who has the rights to fix this, then you can point out one person, give them the access rights. The necessary changes can then be done by that person, but there are later on then logs and checks that can be done to ensure that only the problem was fixed and the privileges were not abused to do anything that might be detrimental to the company. Role design is the main topic here, and that's what we have in the next session, on the next slides. This is really about how to define roles in an efficient way and compliant way to make sure that when you assign access to users, you really know what you're doing, and you also have a good overview of what kind of access you have in your landscape. So here it says a bottom-up business role design. I think on the slides or in the PDF that you have, it still says bottoms-up, but I think that's something different, so I don't know. Yeah, I fixed that here, and also in other places, but yeah, in the PDF you will still see that. Top-down, of course, also works. So you can also just start from scratch, say I want to create a business role and I want to assign that kind of access. But that doesn't happen so often, because most of you are working in companies that already exist, that have been in business for quite some time, where people are already doing their job on a daily basis. So everybody already has some kind of access. So the question is then more, how can I take this access that they have and combine it, consolidate it into business roles that make it easier for me to understand understand what kind of access exists and why certain people have a certain role and others not. So this is something that is then better done in this bottom-up approach, bringing together the access that already exists, analyzing it, and trying to cluster it to make it easier to comprehend what's really going on access-wise in your company. This also then helps with compliance, because if you manage to reduce the number of roles that you need to assign, and if you know that the roles that you assign are clean by themselves, so don't include any critical risks, then the efforts, for example, of a certification campaign are of course much lower. If you assign a role of product manager to somebody who is a product manager, then you will probably say, yes, this person is still a product manager, that's okay. But if a product manager then has 50 roles and you need to decide for each of them whether they are still relevant at a certain point in time, that's of course much more difficult and might also be overwhelming for somebody who is not an expert in this kind of role management. We also have a reconciliation process, but I'll show later on what that actually means. So how are the steps of designing a role? The first step is to mine the roles. In this case, what we mean is that we read the access information from the landscape. So we know for a certain individual, then they have access in this system, these kind of single roles, in that system, those kind of roles. Also, whether these have been used actually. So we can, for example, say for an ABAP system whether somebody has ever used a transaction that's part of a role that is being reviewed here. Because if somebody has too much access, or access that they don't use, then there might be risks for this person that are not at all relevant or not at all necessary, because the person never uses the functionality. So you can just take away that role and they might immediately be compliant again. The next step is then you optimize, and that's where we use our machine learning capabilities to really do a kind of clustering. So to understand who has what kind of access in your organization, and then to bring this together in such a way that we define business roles that allow you to replace many of the individual assignments for users by just one business role that covers all the functionality that might be relevant for a certain task, or at least the plain vanilla functionality that everybody uses who has a certain position in your organization. There will probably still be some small things that need to be added for specific tasks, but in all, the number of assignments that you need to understand and manage becomes much smaller. You can also refine this later on. So I don't have it in the video, but you can also manually intervene here. So sometimes if the machine learning doesn't do it right, or maybe doesn't understand the specifics of your company, you can also step in yourself and move things around a bit to make sure that you really get the best possible mapping between users and roles, and can create business roles based on that. I can explain that on the next slide there. When you've created this kind of role and you've sent it out then as a candidate business role into the approval process, then there is also the compliance check that's happening. So then you can also figure out for a business role, if I'm now creating this role, will this role automatically create risks for my company whenever I assign it? Which could, of course, easily happen. So if you have a role that maybe includes sub-all access and you then start assigning that to people, then of course you have risks everywhere, because then everybody has critical access in some kind of system. And that's something that our solution, Identity Access Governance, can point out. So if you receive or if you define a role and this role includes something that's critical, then you can immediately be notified. Or maybe you have a segregation of duties issue because somebody can maybe change master data and then trigger some transaction based on that. Then you can also step in and say, okay, for this specific role, changing the master data is maybe not even necessary. It's sufficient if they can see the master data. Then I replace the write access with a read access, and then the role suddenly becomes compliant, and I can forward it and use it then for my user assignments, which is actually then the last step, so the provisioning. So I can then say, for those users for which this role makes sense, I now take this role and apply a business role to those users that replaces all those individual single roles, and then makes it much easier to manage the access for those users. And maybe when you do this kind of analysis, you'll also figure out that, I don't know, 90% of people in some department have a certain set of roles, but 10% are missing some kind of access that everybody else has. Then that might be just a mistake. And you'll notice that you can just fix this as part of the process. Here it says bottoms up, so cheers. So this is what's basically happened, what you also see in the video. There's a functionality that takes a snapshot of the access that you have and then tries to cluster it. And if you look at this, it looks a bit like, somebody said last TechEd, like scan disk. So if you remember the defragmentation on Windows, so you start with an extremely fragmented view where you have here a matrix of users that you have here in the rows and columns, which are the roles. And this mapping then creates these dark spots. So whenever a user has a certain role, then you get a black spot there on this chart. And here you see it's quite chaotic, but with a bit of clustering technology, you can find those larger black blocks, which means that whenever you have a large black block, it means that you have a large number of users who have a large number of roles in common. So if you take such a block and turn this into a business role, then all of those users will just have one business role instead of the many single roles that they might have before. Yeah, maybe I'll start with a video here so that you can see how this looks like then in reality. Okay, so here we start the simulator. The first thing that you do, by the way, here is that you need to decide for which part of your organization you want to do this. So you have here the business process, department, company, user group, and function that you need to select, that you can select. And this usually makes a lot of sense. So if you want to do clustering of business roles and try to identify common roles for everybody, then it's probably not a good idea to mix the developers with the CEO, for example, because you would then probably realize that these people do not have that many roles in common, so you will not find any reasonable business roles there. So it usually makes sense to try to find a set of users that is mostly homogeneous, where you would assume that they should have the same kind of access, at least for the most part. And that's what you can do here. And as you do that, then you'll see on the upper right that the number of oh, no, it's not moving. That the number of users that are being managed here then goes down. So we are no longer managing or reviewing access for everybody in the company, but only for this group of users who belong to a specific department, for example. And for them, we are now doing this kind of graphical analysis. And you'll see that we come to this chart, which maps users to roles and then allows you to run the cluster analysis on top of that. Let me stop this here so that you can see this in detail. So here you have on the left side the names of the users, and then in the columns you see all those roles. And if you look in detail, you see there's Ariba stuff. I can also check here. There's ERP stuff and so on. So all of those roles, and whenever there's a dark block there, it means that a single role is assigned to a specific user. And we can now zoom out a bit so that you can see the overall picture, but then you can't see anymore what's really inside of the columns and rows. And then we can run our algorithm on top of that. And this algorithm now tries to move blocks around in such a way that large clusters occur. And that's quite impressive. Of course, it's too good to be true. So in real life, you probably wouldn't end up with something like this. There would be some statistical noise in there because for historical reasons, maybe one person in a department has a role that nobody else has, or one is missing something. But here, for visualization purposes, you can see in an ideal world, you would come to something like this. In a not so ideal world, you might have a screenshot like you saw on the PowerPoint. So large blocks, but then also some noise around this. And these blocks are now candidates for business roles, because each block then means there is a number of users, and these users have the same roles in common. So if I now take this block and turn it into a business role, I just deal with one business role that might include ERP, Ariba, whatever, and I need to only manage that, and I don't need to think about the individual access in all of the systems. Okay, and that's what we are doing here. So we can now mark one of those blocks and say, okay, this is something that I want to turn into a business role. And then the system knows what's behind this. So here we've done it now for many of those. So the system knows now these are the users that should be assigned to this business role. And those are the individual privileges, the individual roles that should also be included in the business role. And we can do that for all of those blocks. And then you see that at the top of the screen, there is a percentage that continues to increase. I'm not sure if you can read it. It's in the gray zone, the current business role coverage. There you see how many of your assignments are now being covered by those business roles that we are just defining here. And as you can see, this now goes up to 70. Here we could even reach then 100% simply by defining business roles. And then we can also check here in detail what we want to do. So which users should get a business role? Do I want to use this, or do I say, yeah, the system has found a business role, but that doesn't make sense for this or that reason, I don't want this? Then you can decide here to delete it. Or you can also say, I want to combine business roles because I know they make sense, even though maybe there are different clusters. I know it still makes sense, and I want to do that. I mentioned earlier that there's also a way to refine this manually. So if you have a lot of noise in there, either you can think about changing the selection filter so that you have then a smaller group of people but with more similar tasks, or you can also move, for example, rows around here. So move them up and down so to make sure that you have a better match in those cases where maybe the machine hasn't learned enough to understand how to best do the matching. Yeah, that was the video. Of course, this is only half of the story. So now you have this candidate business role. But then, of course, the general compliance process continues. So you have then a business role that is a proposal, but you still need to get it approved before it can be rolled out, because this could have, of course, an impact. You might end up giving access to people that they shouldn't have. So there is, again, a compliance check that's going to happen. So somebody then is informed about potential critical access, potential SOD risks that need to be handled. You might find out that you cannot use the business role as it's proposed here, but rather that you have to remove certain single roles, because even though everybody should have them, you still want to treat them separately because they are critical. And then also the other people may have to give an approval. So as mentioned, security owner and so on. Maybe you need to get their approvals, and then in the end, when you have everything, then the business role can be rolled out. As part of the rollout of the business role, there's also this reconciliation step. And this means that we can also say, if we have defined a business role, but there is a handful of users who do not have some parts of this business role. So maybe they have all the access in S4, SuccessFactors, and Ariba, but a few people miss access in Concur, and it doesn't seem right. Then you can say, okay, I want to reconcile this. These people should have the business role, and as a result of that, they will now also get the missing access on the Concur side, so that they really have the full business role access for them and not some gaps in there. And that's what we mean with reconciliation. Yeah, this is the UI, by the way, how it will look like. So if you use the software, the different capabilities that you have here, there you also have this creation of the candidate business roles. And then you can do this kind of reconciliation. So here you can really check what kind of access a person has, and you're also being informed when access is missing. So when you say, I'm assigning the role of product manager to somebody, but in some systems, a product manager really should have this kind of access, and it's still missing for that person, then you can just click, and then this is being sent out as access. Good. We did the demo, of course. There's also this learning experience that I would like to point out. From our experience, it's very difficult to learn stuff if you don't immediately use it. So that's why it's usually good if you have this at your fingertips. So the next time you really want to do this, you can just go back there and take a look. And this is also available then for the TechEd sessions. Actually, this session is also being recorded. That's also why I left some time for questions, that we can handle them in the end. So that I guess that will be cut out later on. So if you don't want to be recorded, don't worry about that. But again, so the idea here being that you really have the information of the session available when you need it, and that you can always come back and learn more about this. There are many more sessions that we have here at TechEd. Here it mentions the IAG roadmap, SEC 814. There is also a hands-on session where you can really then see those steps yourself. The one thing that you will not see unless my colleagues do a demo of it is the actual role design with this machine learning. Because when you do this kind of change on a system, you change, of course, the whole role definition for everybody, and that would then conflict with the other people, with the other participants in the hands-on. But the rest of the process you can see there. So how to do access analysis for an individual person, how to do the role approval process when somebody has defined, for example, with this machine learning capability, candidate business role, how to do the approvals, how to submit this, also how to identify criticalities inside of that role, and how to fix them, either remove access or mitigate this with some kind of mitigation control. And you'll also see certification campaigns and so on. There's also a number of other sessions that are missing here, but you might want to take a look. So on identity and access management, on the identity provisioning service. So again, that's more on the technical side, but might still be relevant and interesting because that's the kind of foundation layer that we built then on top with our identity access governance solution. Okay, with that, I would like to thank you for being here. Thanks for participating. I hope this was interesting. If you want to give feedback, feel free to do so. If you want to get in touch with me, my email address is there. With that, I'd like to say thank you. And with that, we are open then for questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
There is one. Yeah.
So for the people that are doing quarterly or yearly access recertifications, would the person be able to isolate a single role from a business role? So suppose that you have a business role assigned to you, product manager. Yeah. You can keep the business role, but I want you to have not to have specific single roles. Would I be able to do that in that access recertification?
I think that would be possible, but it would probably come up then in the next reconciliation as a potential error. Because the assumption is that you then have the full business role. So you can probably manually remove that, but it would probably be confusing to the system if you do that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, then thanks a lot. Enjoy.